Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the second day of the third weekend of the caucus. It's like we're striking off the calendar as we get through. It's extraordinary to see so many of you back here, and we're really glad to welcome those who are coming for the first time to the Eindhoven caucus. We repeat constantly what this caucus is, so some of you are completely sick of hearing that, I think, but I think it's important to just set the scene. The caucus is part of a two-year project that we've been developing called Becoming Dutch, and for us it's a kind of extended moment, a public think tank, a chance to test our ideas and try and work and think with all of you and some of the most extraordinary thinkers and speakers that we're so grateful have given up their time to come and be with us. The caucus also connotes a kind of political think tank, a possibility of thinking about policy or making decisions for society. So it also implicates all of us as creative thinkers in thinking through that possibility. And that seems like an interesting and important model to explore. So thank you for being here to help us do that. We still feel after these intense weeks inspired and engaged by all of you coming and taking on this task of creating a caucus as a place to think about our political responsibility as creative citizens. It's a complex process, and building up such an intense and extraordinary list of visitors and speakers and seeing and hearing them for the first time, perhaps we've read many of them, seems to us an extraordinary opportunity. And so we're very grateful to all of you for making that happen. It's a way for us, I think, as Charles explained yesterday, to also deepen and sharpen our own thinking as a museum and as a set of people who are trying to think about the relevance of what we produce and what art can say right now. Right from the first weekend with Paul Scheffer, Abdelkader Ben Ali and Roger Burgle, we've played out a relationship between the understanding of our own position right here, right now in the Netherlands, against the context of the wider world and recent theoretical developments. And this I hope we'll continue to do over the time. I think it's always important to come back to where we are and what we're going to do. In the spirit of building up this knowledge that as we have been, I'm just going to recap a little bit about yesterday because I think it's always wonderful to, we have many people who come back and return, and also our participants who have stayed here for the last 2 weeks and are still going and still standing, which is rather amazing. And this critical mass that we have the opportunity to build up is so valuable. But I think it's nice always to recap a little bit of the ideas and the ghosts of the ideas that have been floating around over the last days. So yesterday we began the day with the art critic and writer and curator Boris Groys. He spoke to us about religion as a medium and conversely medium as religion. He suggested that the very mechanisms of video and digital data propagate new fundamental religions, which at their basis, he argues, are not a set of opinions, but rather a ritual of opinionlessness. The afternoon consisted of a panel which explored the potential of art to speak to the world. We tried to crack at that old chestnut, that one that museums constantly struggle with, whether art is a state of autonomy and how one maintains an idea of autonomy or collapses it. Els van der Plas expanded on her work from a transnational perspective, explaining that she works on a global scale in areas that she called socially and economically complex. Charles Esche, sort of in reply to this, brought the focus back to the Netherlands again, thinking about the work of Arnoud Miek and suggesting that we also need to think about how and why the Netherlands should be understood as socially and economically complex. Sarah Pearce eloquently outlined her position as an artist and how we might understand autonomous spaces as those that cannot be claimed or have yet to be claimed. We ended our day with the artistic presentation of Artur Chmielewski and his polemic piece, video work called Them, which he explained, or I thought it was very interesting, he sort of articulated as a way of democratizing conflict. And finally, it was, we were given a tour. We went to, with the artists Bick van der Pol generously set up the beginning of their project. We've invited them to develop a project for Becoming Dutch. And they have decided to start looking at the Evoluon, this spaceship-like building, which talks of the future, talks of the alien perhaps. And so there was a tour yesterday, and that was how we ended. We finally got out of the auditorium and into Eindhoven. It's taken us a long time to do that, so thank you for making us escape the museum for a while. And so to today. Today I'm sure will be full of wonderful new arguments and thinking. And I'm very, very honoured and delighted to have Paul Gilroy here, who will be our keynote speaker this morning. Paul is currently lecturing at the London School of Economics in London. So thank you, Paul.
Well, I'm very happy to have the chance to participate in this exercise, and would like to thank the people that thought I might be able to contribute to it. We are repeatedly informed that Europe's 20th century experiments with multiculturalism are over. And as you know, I'm sure, a version of the history of the Netherlands circulates very prominently in rationalizations of that negative verdict. We're told that these initiatives have failed because every treacherous immigrant, of course your allochtone blurs the relationship between immigrants and their descendants, so when I say immigrant, I'm using it in your sense to mean anybody who in any way in the past, if they fall into certain criteria, is connected to the experience of immigration, even if they've not themselves migrated. It's a translation issue. Anyway, any of these people, any of these allochtones, any of these immigrants, although actually we don't speak of them like that in England, can become a terrorist. So that sets up a problem. And the disenchanted white working class found in various European cultures is claiming loudly to have been cheated out of its civic patrimony. Governments profess a great concern that their authentic, their indigenous, their autochthonous citizens are propelled into the arms of the ultranationalist right by what are, at root, legitimate grievances. Grievances held against the incomers who've stolen their jobs, polluted their streets, diverted their political entitlements into devious schemes designed to secure preferential treatment. And whole new apparatuses, new varieties of social theory, political reflection, are being created at the moment to endorse and to disseminate that hypothesis. It corresponds, on the one hand, to the fortification of Europe against the encroachments of the complex places, the global south, and, on the other hand, to the idea that we are now in the grip of a clash of civilizations. And I want to challenge those ideas. These misguided governmental schemes that were responsible for post-colonial immigration and unmanageable multiculture, which followed it, are also judged to have failed because the cohesion of Europe's besieged national states is now supposed to depend upon a high degree of sameness. We unpack the idea of identity. One of the things we find in it is the idea of sameness. There are other things, of course, solidarity, subjectivity, but I want to focus now on sameness. The fantasy that national communities rely upon a kind of hyper-similarity has taken hold. And that belief is associated with another one, with the idea that cultural homogeneity can somehow offset the antisocial effects of economic and social inequality. That homogeneity is now a precious, functional thing. It's seen either as a precondition for continuing Europe's dwindling social model, or as some sort of essential overture to the reforms that neoliberalism and a process of globalization as Americanization require. Of course, at a deeper level, we're also warned that these experiments have failed because of cultural relativism, because of political correctness that's being taught in universities and perhaps practiced in institutions like this one, where solid aesthetic judgment is traduced and the destruction of real art is regularly celebrated. At least that's what I was led to believe. So. The refusal to stand up for our historic values in the face of this corruption and betrayal has taken a great toll. And the state of emergency in which we now live makes our values very hard to specify and possibly difficult to project in a consistent manner. This is the script. In the context of a neo-imperialist military adventure, though, promoting those values is often, I would say, an attempt to answer the charge that universal standards are nothing but some sort of thin ethno-historical achievement, something that's too easily made compatible with the exigencies of imperialism and racial hierarchy, recast in uncomfortably culturalist form. One of those forms would be xenology, this the ology of strangeness, of strangers, xenology. Governments feel that though these perennial outsiders in Europe have been to some extent integrated, they have not been assimilated at the rate that present circumstances require. And I think we need to identify that distinction, even though I know your local language of autochthonous and non-autochthonous articulates it somewhat differently. We have to try and identify the moment of incorporation, if you like, with the moment of assimilation, where you move into the homogeneity I was describing a moment before. We have to recognize that distinction then between a basic integration and more elaborate mechanisms of assimilation, which is desired but which is not apparently there. Both of those terms, integration and assimilation, presuppose particular ways of thinking about culture and difference. They promote a common view of cohesion, solidarity, and above all, the sameness that are thought to be essential now that national communities are viewed as primarily cultural rather than political in character. This promotes what Mahmoud Mamdani, the Ugandan political theorist, calls culture talk. Culture talk. And culture talk refers us not to a world of conflicting ideas and ideologies, but to a shadowland of nebulous values in which can become momentarily, if you like, embodied in iconic ciphers of cultural difference. Yesterday, we started to talk about religion, and then we suddenly ended up talking about Islam. It was a very rapid change. It wasn't long before the veiled woman appeared in our discourse without being queued up for that epiphany. So I'm interested in those things as symptoms. Now, the decisive difference, the difference that's really, really different, is really, really different, is now, after what we might call the UNESCO interlude of the later 20th century, this difference is now, just as it was in the 19th century, imagined and thought to be absolute, to be natural, to be geopolitical, and to be unbridgeable. So some distinctive, I guess I'd call them parapolitical forms of reflection have emerged with all this theorizing, these nostrums. And this parapolitics has been invented from the idea of culture itself. I think the key to grasping its power is a realization that from the rather nostalgic angle of vision that it values and promotes, cultural diversity is itself always suspect, is always illegitimate. The accommodation of plurality and peace is as unthinkable now as the practical reconciliation of solidarity with diversity. Of course, those terms, plurality, diversity, are also quite frequently coded terms for racialized and ethnic variations and hierarchies. Plurality and diversity always now involve risk, and we are required to recognize those risks and to recognize that diversity, that plurality as a potential source of catastrophic violence. The rewritten political conventions of secure national states now dictate that a stable polity can only ever comfortably accommodate monoculture, brittle, invariant, immobile, and yet, in these stormy conditions of ours, solidarizing. Now, of course, you know, these assumptions about the optimal relationship between culture and nationality have other consequences. They specify that the ways in which people form and reproduce the social groups to which they imagine they belong derive from an essential disposition, a disposition to associate positively only with those they see as already like themselves. And an underlying tendency towards sameness trumps all other social processes. This is a quiet endorsement of a point of view I suppose I'd call a hyper-nationalist point of view, and I think it's particularly damaging now. Now in the context of a securitocracy where politicians are also striving to recode the populist instincts to which that demand for social solidarity remains captive. Culture supplies the watchword for all this clustering, the clustering that is required in order to be safe. Nations must bond together, but if the immigrants and the allochtones attempt that same defensive maneuver, their communities must be bridged, ventilated, in order to secure a larger national cohesion. Ossified and instrumentalized like this, culture can be somehow insulated from the pressures of history, everyday accommodation, and of course, of creativity. Culture in this form effectively captures us, pickling people or marking them forever as this or that, sheep or goat. National groups that are judged worthy of recognition are invited then to take possession of the inert that distinguishes them, their absolute culture. And they're required to hold on to that culture, to hang on to it as if it was a form of property. That absolute culture becomes enthralling. It reduces citizens to transient elements in a longer story of political ontology and racial character, which is maintained in a sort of simple functional harmony with what we might call the ecologies of belonging that characterize and distinguish different European national states. The recurrence of these motifs is a small, I think, but telling part of a depoliticizing mechanism that inflates and amplifies contemporary culture talk in this unique setting provided by officially endorsed fantasies of long-term conflict. The repetition and emergence of these ideas as a kind of common sense explanation of the history of the present itself conveys the securitocracy's version of geopolitics, of race and ethnicity. And it's being circulated, even as we speak here, as part of the info war, in which any encounter with unassimilable otherness can turn out to be deadly. Of course, this sense of an ideal relationship between culture and nationality has a long historical pedigree, which I can't reconstruct now. The projection of a racial nomos, as a natural, inevitable fate for humankind, receives its modern imprimatur in the subjugation of the New World. It's something which is refined during the colonial and imperial phases in which European powers, different ones, even this one, dominated the planet. I want to come to the consequences of overlooking that history in a moment, but at the moment it seems particularly important to appreciate that the version of political technology favoured in governing multiculture, certainly in my country and perhaps also elsewhere in Europe, in France most certainly, corresponds most closely to the pattern of racial and ethnic segregation and hierarchy generated by the history of the United States. Those techniques are seldom seen as the eventual results of their settler colonialism, of slavery, of a genocidal war against indigenous people. Yesterday, Charles, in replying to Els van der Plas, spoke about the situation in Palestine as something that we might reflect on with a view to our own futures. I think the question of time in this is very, very important, because for all my life, all my conscious life, I've been told that the United States was ahead of Europe. It was ahead. It was ahead of England. It was one of the ways in which it was proved to be ahead was around this question of race, you see? Our politicians in the 1960s went off to the United States. They sent fact-finding missions. That's not a phrase we hear very much anymore. It's a symptom of a different regime of truth. So no fact-finding missions. No fact-finding missions are dispatched to Washington to find out how to either embrace or to avoid the American future. But we quarrel instead in the 70s about whether America was 10 or 15 or 20 years ahead. I'm not sure that that particular telos is something we can support any longer. So I'm not sure about the future, but I do know that in terms of the political technologies for managing multicultural life, for managing plurality and diversity, this is being imported from the US. Largely, and I'm absolutely confident that the Dutch world in political and its corporate moments is not immune to this through the language of management theory and management practice itself, the corporate language of controlling and manipulating the world. Okay, now I think we're very much disadvantaged in reflecting on these matters by the fact that academic professionalism is itself often defined by a reluctance to analyze racism or exclusion, which promoted these distinctive patterns of state building in the colonial world, particularly the US, but also intervened there in democracy's unfolding by barring the path of some groups to citizenship. And so that refusal to think about racism, I know it's terribly vulgar to come in here and talk about racism, actually. I do know that that's a problem for some folk. But I think we need to recognize where that inhibition comes from. And certainly those of you who are involved in teaching or working in university environments will know what you sacrifice when you try and make that into a serious topic of conversation in those institutions in these times. That refusal to engage racism's impact on contemporary social and political life is integral then to focusing attention exclusively on the cultural dynamics I described. It's integral to presenting culture as both problem and solution. Making racism appear politically trivial, making it appear intellectually insignificant, is therefore part of naturalizing the reproduction of racial hierarchies, folding ethnic absolutism, culture talk, back into the government of national states. The idea that the ongoing effects of racism and exclusion might actually even now be inclining some people, towards forms of solidarity that are found in what are described as fundamentalist political groups, priming them, for example, for the seductions of occultism or conspiracy theory or political Islam, remains largely undiscussed. And those bodies of thought supply powerful sources of certainty in a political and economic and technological environment where anxiety and insecurity are the dominant social characteristics, the signatures. Okay, a tiny minority of people, of course, do resolve their political hopes by becoming agents of eschatological terror. But they don't do that because their culture or their faith inevitably disposes them towards that outcome. I think a more elaborate and more sophisticated account of their development, their becoming terrorist, is required of us, and the decision to act violently may involve aesthetic elements and, of course, from the point of view of its practitioners, is likely to be understood as an ethical decision in the context of a just war framework. If we were to look at the video of Mohammed Sadiq Khan, one of the bombers who blew up the underground in London in July of 2005, you will see from his video that he says clearly that this is an ethical act in the context of a war which is being fought elsewhere in the world, and that he wishes to bring that war back into the city, into the capital of the nation into which he was born. Now, he's not someone who needed to learn to speak better English. He's someone who knew how to punctuate a sentence. He's someone who had been highly educated. Someone who, according to all the rules and calculations and templates we have for judging the progress of the immigrant into the natural position, had passed all those tests. So it's a different sort of problem than the Manichaean answer to analysing it would want us to see. Okay. Well, I think it bears repetition that the politics of race and national identity is being freshly tailored to the outline, not of security, but of securitocracy. That's a term I used earlier on without glossing it. For me, securitocracy is a novel form of power, a form of rule which carries a deep imprint of colonial statecraft into the present. It merges police power with military power. It blurs older metropolitan distinctions between the inside and the outside. You know, I'm sure you've all heard about the execution is the word, sorry, of Jean-Charles de Menezes in the underground system in London. I was very struck in reading the accounts of the various legal proceedings that have flowed from that horrible tragedy, that the gentlemen who were primed with surveying him as he came out of his building were from the army, but the ones with whom they were communicating were from the police. I don't know, you know, certainly in the history of our country, if you go back 30 years to the legal and political order of the conflict of the war in Northern Ireland, the question of military aid to civil power, how one legal order connected to the other. These were major questions of debate. The intellectual army officers went to write their PhDs in law and so on, and they were all very exercised about this question of military aid to civil power. It was a cipher of a certain set of issues that came actually directly from fighting particular kinds of wars in colonial struggles elsewhere, in Africa, particularly in Kenya, in Cyprus, in Aden, and we could go on. Actually, I won't make that list now. But the point is that there was a problem there, and it was recognized as one that spoke to the core, the integrity of our democracy, this relationship between police and military. One of the signature features of this securitocracy is that it dissolves that line in exactly the way that the colonial state, that the colonial government would have dissolved that line. Okay. Now, I want to suggest that there are many dangers in this moment that arise from the institutional retreat of critical scholarship, present company accepted. Whatever its shortcomings, that process, that pattern of intervention in the academy has delivered, I think, promised and delivered rich considerations of how cultures and their workings impact on political consciousness and experience. The reversal, then, of critical cultural studies broadly identified has been counterpointed by a second setback. I think academics have become timid. I think they've withdrawn into the shelter provided by their disciplines that they fled in an earlier phase. And now they've started to redraw scholastic boundaries, but to mark them much more deeply and to police the operation of crossing those boundaries, a bit like national states. I remember once hearing that hearing Arjun Appadurai say that disciplines were like national states and one should collect as many passports as possible in one's career. I think there's a feature of that analogy which is helpful in thinking about how these different sets of changes correspond to one another. The borders, of course, fall in different places. And these changes then fit very well with a mood of shallow professionalization which is diluting the intellectual life of our universities wherever we are. Now that, and one which pressures them, I think, strongly into becoming appendages of corporate and governmental powers, pressures them in being unable to approach education as either a civic good or a public good. And, you know, there is, of course, there are other factors like the banalization of cultural studies, the rise of identity politics figured through absolutist renderings of culture, which has been pitched into the same set of institutional difficulties. Okay, and so I want us to also address that context. One of our interfaces in this caucus is with educational institutions, so I think it would be folly not to acknowledge what's going on in those spaces, which of course has implications for the life of institutions like this. Well, that rather gloomy scenario I've described is the setting in which a kind of race-friendly cultural law, largely borrowed from the history of the United States, now functions a kind of common sense or default in this area of thinking multiculture. I want to submit to you that their parochial views of these questions are now being projected worldwide as the very best way to understand racialized politics and to govern the problems created by racial and ethnic hierarchy. In the US, the successful story of settler colonialism there has supplied us with foundational norms in debates about the perils of cultural heterogeneity, the negative impact of diversity and immigration. US history and political culture are used to generate ideal types that indicate the future for everybody else on Earth when it comes to race. Racism and cultural diversity. US-derived models are advanced as if they reveal a desirable balance between discretely separable civic and ethnic versions of nationalism. US racial technologies such as identity politics, affirmative action, profiling, perhaps even the ambivalence that was spoken about last week, are exported then as a kind of ready-made solution to the problems wrought by racism, diversity, and multiculture. Now, I've said I think we can challenge the telos on which that rests. I think my response to all these problems is not only to call for a better theory of cultural plurality, one that's more, that explains our reality, our circumstances better. I think that's needed. I think it's perhaps more important, though, to draw attention, rather than to theorize, to draw attention descriptively to the patterns of what I call convivial social interaction that are practiced ordinarily and routinely in the everyday life, particularly of post-colonial cities in Europe. That everyday activity shifts the interpretive focus away from the cultural resources that precede events, precede things that happen in the post-colonial contact zone. Attention is directed instead towards the tempo and the character of habitual interaction. Sometimes that involves care, sometimes it involves conflict. The pleasures that arise there across cultural lines, all of these things, care, conflict, pleasure, they destabilize the notion that this contact with difference, with otherness, proceeds from sealed up or segregated enclaves, from safe houses. We need a better sense of agency in this interpretation of these encounters beyond the idea that we are just sort of units that carry our culture. Our polities are not mosaics composed of cultural fragments that can be arranged into a national picture. We can discover, by focusing on the problem of conviviality, some dizzying cosmopolitan patterns, unruly desire, routine translation, transcultural imagination. All of this attends the conviviality, the economic aspects of conviviality, and all of it informs the the vernacular sociality that conviviality promotes. Even if that conviviality is articulated as a form of solidarity bound by class or by locality, these varieties of contact should be recognized as productive. I think they've often generated rich civic and democratic interactions, especially when racism and ethnic absolutism were identified and then perhaps even temporarily overcome. Let me give you a practical example of that. When I was a teenager, you could be arrested for looking as though you were about to commit a crime. Only some people were arrested for looking as though they were about to commit a crime, but that was a crime. To look as though you were about to commit a crime to a reasonable person was a crime. In fact, at the moment, there's a desire to revive a law like this. It was actually a law passed in the early 19th century, in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, because people who had served in the conflict were not going home quickly enough. I suppose they were going native or dawdling and not finding their way back to where they belonged. So the government passed this law, a vagrancy law, which specified that if you looked as if you might be about to commit a crime, you were committing a crime. Now, after a long struggle, we managed to have that law removed from our statute book, and you can no longer, I mean, there are other mechanisms and devices, of course. I'm not naively saying that that was the once and for all victory. But I want to illustrate the idea that once we remove from the statute book a law which says that you are committing a crime if you look as though you might be about to commit a crime, that that's actually an enhancement or refinement of our democracy, which benefits everybody. Okay? It's not an ethnic achievement. It's not some sort of narrow gain. It's something which deepens and makes our reflexive democracy seem deeper, more complex and worthwhile, more worthy of attachment. Okay? So, and there are many examples like that that I could offer you. And I know also that here, as there are many people struggling at different altitudes than the ones we are sharing this morning to do that kind of work. How we engage them and how their practice informs our discussion of culture is, of course, in our hands. Okay, so consider that idea that the refusal of racial hierarchy, the refusal of ethnic absolutism, involves assets which can deepen democracy and usefully complicate the fragile, universal humanity to which rights are addressed and rights are attached. I think it's possible that that convivial contact across culture lines can augment the economic networks found even in the poorest and most conflict-ridden communities. These emergent formations of conviviality do more than supply the ground on which Europe's problems of security are going to be settled. They also suggest that Europe shouldn't continue to import US-oriented conceptions of ethno-racial difference, that Europe shouldn't use spurious accounts of the supposedly natural tendency towards homogeneity, which have been generated by US-based intellectuals. And here I'm thinking particularly of their conceptions of social capital, which are very popular in our government. I don't know if they've been picked up by your government yet. Okay. Of course, if it sounds as though I'm bashing the US rather strongly in their export of racial technology to the world, let me immediately acknowledge that Europe has its own problems in this area, particularly the problem of amnesia. Failure to work through that colonial history in different countries, I think, well, failure to address the consequences of vanished imperial prestige now renders many European nations vulnerable to the simplistic and the Manichaean political solutions being offered in the name of armoured humanitarianism on one side and resurgent imperial ambition on the other. Though, of course, it's perfectly compatible with the contemporary decline of education in our countries, the failure to be familiar with colonial history presents new problems, particularly if the people that you're committed to fighting indefinitely, in order to save them, of course, have retained rather detailed, rather comprehensive historical knowledge of your past encounters, which may even be motivating them in their determination to act against you. In the info war, there is a kind of imbalance of historical information. And that is also, I'm being more serious now, disadvantageous for any attempts to develop global approaches to justice, power and security. Even so close to The Hague, it's disadvantageous. It reminds us that the world we share is not a blank sheet. Its boundaries were established not only, as Boris suggested, by the end of Soviet communism, but actually by the end of colonial administration and colonial rule, by the breakup of colonial structures, which have conditioned the architecture of both economic and cultural globalization, as well as the thwarted and widely ridiculed desire for recognition of Europe's past crimes. The crimes of this country in its colonial administration, I think, are a taboo subject here. That's my impression, even though I did hear, last time I was in the Netherlands, I was on a coach at another conference of a rather more august body, no offence, and I overheard a conversation between two Dutch gentlemen, I don't know who they were, and two American journalists who were talking about the role of the Dutch special forces in killing people in Afghanistan and how efficient they were at the job that they were being asked to do. So I sat there mutely in the corner and tuned my ears up louder. In our country, part of the weird militarization and this concern with national social capital, the sense that we're not bonding enough, appears in terms of around this idea of a national spirit that has to be sort of infused, and people are, testing the immigrants on their English. And of course, these tests are all tests that the people who already live in the country who don't have to submit to this kind of scrutiny have no idea about. If you open the new booklet our government has prepared for the of testing for the regime, you pay a vast amount of money and they test you on whether you're allowed to become not just a citizen now, but a resident too. The first thing you see is a picture of the White Cliffs of Dover, the symbolic threshold of the nation. And on Wednesday night, much of this is, of course, bound up with sport. I have one or two more things to say about sport in a moment as a cipher of melancholia. But, Wednesday night, they were right to be melancholy. What's more interesting about the defeat of the football team on Wednesday night was that before the game, and this wasn't shown in the international television coverage, there was supposed to be a parade of maimed soldiers before the game that was going to win the support of anybody who was watching for the national war effort in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Now, for me, this is what, when I speak about the importation of US racial technologies, these are the sort of things I mean. The national anthem was sung before the game. Well, that's not something that has always happened. And the way it's now sung, very significantly, they got a black guy to sing the national anthem and the Croatian national anthem before the game began. How that went down in Zagreb, I wouldn't like to say. But it did happen. That roused my own patriotism, of course, a little bit. But my point is that these technologies, these off-the-shelf recipes from the textbook of corporate multiculture are now being applied in a political sphere, in a political space. And they're addressed to the idea of giving people back their culture in certain forms. Forms that are amenable to militarization, forms that are amenable to what I called hypersimilarity, forms that are amenable to the development, to the prosecution of info war. Now, in the info war, I talked about the problem of the imbalance of historical information. Of course, it's not just that people don't remember the past and the people they're fighting do remember it, those wars of conquest and wars of national liberation, wars of decolonization, were particular kinds of conflict. And they press, as well as the fact that there's a memory imbalance, they press very heavily on the present. There are lingering injuries there, born from particular kinds of warfare that didn't distinguish habitually between combatants and non-combatants, warfare that didn't shrink from the deployment of torture or ritual brutality as administrative technique. And I think the sometimes genocidal practices of colonial government were anchored in an immoral certainty that the forces of nature and of civilization could be combined in governmental mechanisms which ensured the survival of the fittest. And I think actually some of that is being revived. I think some of that is being... There's a rather different version, a quieter version of the doctrine of what Sven Lindqvist calls the doctrine of doomed races. But it's not the doctrine of doomed races now, it's the doctrine of doomed cultures, you know, and I'll come to that at the end. The point is that unprocessed colonial past can intervene on either side of the culture line, and it makes our current political situation more hazardous and more intractable. And overdue coming to terms with the consequences of departed colonial power isn't just a way to make the problems wrought by racial hierarchy visible. It's also a means to bring these difficult issues out of the official domain of culture and put them back inside the proper world of politics. The argument that post-colonial minorities have illegitimately demanded special treatment is less plausible, I think, when we take that history into account. And the idea that European democracy might even be enriched by facing up to the history of its debasement and its abbreviation in colonial statecraft is disappointingly hard to win. Of course, one other gain in bringing that colonial history properly into our sense of the present would be that the Nazi genocide itself, the re-importation or the importation of those colonial techniques into the core of Europe, becomes then less than a sort of sublime eruption of unfathomable evil, becomes belatedly something else that can be addressed as history rather than mythology. I want to emphasize that there are links then between a more healthy relationship to that imperial and colonial past and the vitality and sustainability of a multiculture which has developed in different parts of Europe, and which I think is worth defending. And the strategy for that ongoing work, of course, varies from country to country. There isn't a common recipe. When I was in Portugal earlier in the year, I was very much struck by the idea that the link between decolonization and the establishment of democracy seemed to be critical. People talk about democracy, but they don't see how it's linked to the decolonization process. The relationship of the colonial government to domestic fascism is important in that case too. The political and legal continuities that linked undemocratic habits in national politics to imperial administration will also have to be debated across a number of different cases. In France, the refusal to consider post-colonial dynamics as significant in any way have, of course, been amplified by the effects of a republican tradition that needs to be given an entirely new genealogy. Here in the Netherlands, you know, and I don't normally care for Ian Baruma, but I did think his book was a good starting point for a conversation about some of these things. There is a sense that a locally oriented account of the larger social and cultural forces that make immigration into a permanent twilight condition seems important, you know, particularly in view of Black Peter's imminent arrival with all your Christmas goodies. In the Nordic countries, the past colonial adventures remain deeply hidden, and there, of course, their profit from the wars waged by others can't really be ignored in this reckoning. The prominence of their polities in theories advanced by commentators who do see the value of homogeneity also seems important, because when the US political theorists say diversity is bad, homogeneity is good, where do they look for empirical cases? They usually go to the Nordic countries or to Japan, actually. And both places, that seems a rather crazy idea. But we need to know what the political geography of their homogeneity actually involves. Now, my own country, major offender in all of this, sort of blundered into an uneven but yet habitable multiculture only because the government was entirely absent from promoting that outcome. Patchy acknowledgements of the power and of the imperial and colonial history are occasionally made, as for example during the recent discussions of the commemorations of the passage of legislation that brought the slave trade to an end. And I think there are, you know, I mean, I mentioned the football earlier on. It's always, for me, extraordinary when you actually go into the stadium, how successful and how wonderful the banishment of racial abuse from that space has been. That people actually worked very hard to make that go away from there. I mean, there are other problems, of course, now created where every little trivial thing becomes an instance of that. But I'd rather have that kind of watchfulness. I'd rather have that sort of care, that sense that these things don't belong in a public space of that kind than to have the opposite. And I think that's again, that's a model for me of the kind of enrichment of that democracy that I spoke of earlier on. Okay, right. Now, I want to emphasize that the project here, Becoming Dutch, seems to me to arise amidst the pressure to redefine and to renew not national culture, but European culture in post-colonial circumstances. And we've seen that the novelty of this moment is confirmed by the unprecedented extent to which these conflicts in the world are thought to grow out of cultural differences. The world has been deeply divided over these events, which have prompted the emergence of new patterns of global public opinion. And of course, in Europe, these developments have created an incredible disillusion, reminiscent in some respects of the condition that Freud described in his heartfelt account of the climate created amongst the civilized and would-be cosmopolitans of Europe by the outbreak of the 1914-18 war. The national loyalties of the group to which Freud said he belonged have been qualified by their attachment to their fatherland, but also by their attachment to what he calls their second fatherland. And that additional patriotism was, for him, a strongly cultural variety of attachment. It had been discovered by an appreciation of the great artistic fruits of humankind, which pointed in turns to the pleasures and the transcendent aesthetic value of a common, supranational European civilization. You remember, he speaks about encountering the whole of world culture as though it were in a museum. The Great War, which marked of course, a sharp disregard for the conventions of international law, ruptured those patterns in which those contending loyalties, one national, the other civilizational, had been possible to reconcile. And his disillusion is with the inability to hold those things together. Of course, you know, those things, that problem finds later expression in the way that modernism develops subsequently. Today, it seems imperative that responses to the insecurity of Europe's cultural resources are not made continuous with geopolitical and economic anxieties. A temptation to indulge in that kind of analysis has grown stronger since this idea of a clash of civilizations was projected as an interpretive framework, capable of connecting, I don't know, the riots in Paris, the murder of Theo van Gogh, the Danish provocations with the cartoons, and the wars in Afghanistan and Mesopotamia. All of that seems to be the clash of civilizations. The hidden component, though, driving on this deliberation is a great need to specify exactly who may now count as a European and what that attachment is going to involve in today's insecure and unsettling conditions. Instead of reading and writing and creating and debating in order to discover who we are, in order to find out what we must become, we're asked instead to establish and then to enforce fixed identity as the precondition for attachment to national states, as a starting point for any pursuit of that ephemeral universality, which has been the historic counterpart to that attachment. And of course, a particular set of ethnocentric judgments of progress, often defined by the idea of tolerance, articulated in particular around questions of sex and sexuality. All of that supplies, I think, a rather arbitrary benchmark for the calculations that will say who's fit to be a citizen here and now. Yet across Europe, let me emphasize this, there are very few ideologues of a relativistic or simple-minded multiculturalism to be seen. There are no advocates of facile relativism queuing up to argue that cultures are absolutely incorrigible and that they all require the same forms of recognition. I know it was suggested at one point by Charles Taylor, among others, that a presumption of equal cultural worth was a useful starting point in orchestrating a kind of transcultural dialogue upon which liberalism might now depend. But nobody is actually arguing that cultural formations were interchangeable, that they all required the same forms of recognition, or that it should all be evaluated only by their insiders. Partisans for multiculture and diversity in those forms turn out to be very difficult to locate. I don't know if you found any here. I've been looking, I haven't found any. Very few intellectuals, apart from those who were themselves migrants, were prepared to sacrifice their own seriousness so cheaply. And of course, the politicians long ago worked out they have nothing to gain from espousing these unpopular causes. Of course, in what remains of our public culture, there's an overflow of those who want to argue the opposite position. Whether they're based on common sense or ethnocentric grounds or pragmatic grounds, the objectivist case, the authoritarian case, have no shortage of advocates. Let me conclude then by criticizing the idea that to function optimally, national states have to be based upon that obvious, facile sameness, the sameness which is amenable to being engineered from above, the view which says the more homogeneity, the better. Though the precise scale upon which these arguments are supposed to operate is very seldom made explicit, we're told that people are getting worse at imagining a likeness across the large cultural distances that separate them, that separate the citizen from the denizen. And here the link with racism and nationalism, of course, again pronounced. The unwanted alien incomers in Britain can never authentically belong because they didn't fight in the war against Germany, although of course they did fight in the war against Germany, or because they work too hard, or because they work too cheaply, or because they don't speak the language like the locals do. Of course, if they do speak the language like the locals do, another set of problems arise. And of course, if they seduce the locals into speaking the language the way that they speak it, then things really get bad. I mean, the legend in London, I will say, is that Robin van Persie speaks Dutch with a Moroccan accent. I don't know if there's anyone here who can testify to that. So I'd want to use that as an example of the kind of corruption I'm speaking about. I've suggested, based on Britain in particular, that this figure of the homegrown terrorist is decisive. That in our case, the homegrown terrorist is displacing the immigrant, the economic migrant, the asylum seeker, the refugee, that this homegrown terrorist becomes the conventional avatar of insecurity, articulated in cultural terms. And I said, when I alluded to the case in the video of Mohammed Sadiq Khan, that the biographies of those perpetrators of terror provide interesting source material in assessing the dimensions of this inter-civilizational war. I want to repeat that many of those fifth columnists turn out to be highly educated, and that fact alone makes their treachery part of a natural or ethnic disposition, which cannot possibly be trained out of them. I think, some would say that this is a matter of religion. I think that within our discourse it's still yet unclear whether it will be judged ultimately as a religious deviation or a natural deviation. Perhaps both. We don't have to have a choice. Okay. I want to draw attention also to the number of converts in this scheme, because converts are a significant proportion of the recruits to the terrorist dismal cause, and it would be dishonest to deny that some of them seem to have turned to political Islam as a reaction against the shallowness and the meaninglessness of the consumerist cornucopia. Actually, I've always believed, and I think now that there is research that begins to bear this out, that it's our prison system which is the place where these forms of political attachment and solidarity are being most energetically produced and recycled. Okay, so that too, I think, takes us away from a simple notion of a cultural script. One of the other suicide bombers of July 2005, Tanweer, went into McDonald's to have a last snack before he went off to blow himself up, which is hardly the view of someone who's sort of consistently and comfortably able to exist within a sense of this jahiliyyah. The barbarous ignorance can sometimes taste good, it would appear. Okay. Among the xenophobes, though, and among their foes, the appeal of certainty, the appeal of hierarchy, the appeal of closed and fortified ways of life seems to be connected with components which are borrowed from more familiar generic versions of revolutionary conservatism, ultranationalism, and occultism. The adapters, the adherents, the practitioners of these ideologies may not even be aware of the history of the gestures that they're repeating. And these convergences, borrowings, and recodings constitute an uncomfortable reminder that the rifts and fissures within civilizations account for rather more than the conflict we imagine between them. The central point, though, is that the renewal of a dynamic and profound European cultural tradition, actually something to which I want to be committed, capable of repudiating simplistic culture talk, capable of answering civilizationism, demands a task of reconstruction that we have to take seriously. And for me, this means most fundamentally reckoning with Europe's past colonial history and with its post-colonial predicament. And that must be done explicitly and consistently. More than that, I think it's important not to refuse the depths of those difficulties or to try flatly to deny that Europe's cultural resources were insufficient to obstruct the other racial genocide abroad or at home. That tradition contained within it, the European tradition in the past, contained within it certain possibilities that were neither wholly necessary in the unfolding of that deadly outcome nor completely contingent in the development of palingenetic ultranationalism and its perils. If the task of reckoning with that history could be undertaken, then Europe will, I think, be much better equipped to reflect on the ongoing connections of racialized political ontology with the statecraft and what we might think of as an institutionalized double standard being practiced and celebrated today. One influential EU diplomat, Robert Cooper, has explained exactly what is now involved in the rebirth of Europe's colonial dominion in the world. I'm quoting from Cooper's book, The Breaking of Nations, here. When dealing with the more old-fashioned kinds of state outside the post-modern limits, Europeans need to revert to the rougher methods of an earlier era. Force, preemptive attack, deception, whatever is necessary for those who still live in the 19th century world of every state for itself. In the jungle, concludes Cooper, one must use the laws of the jungle. While his words are striking, he's the EU foreign policy very highly placed in the EU foreign policy bureaucracy, and he's the Jiminy Cricket who was whispering in Tony Blair's ear much of the last few years, but he now whispers in Javier Solana's ear instead. And his words are striking for the way that they suggest the permissive habits acquired where the laws of the jungle are practiced will not leak inconveniently or undemocratically back into postmodern Europe's political and judicial machinery. I would suggest to you that that jungle now reaches all the way back into London, into this city probably, certainly into Stockwell Station, where de Menezes was executed, but also into other as yet unnamed locations where shady procedures for preemptive execution, rendition, and so on will doubtless be implemented. The problems encapsulated in that colonial double standard, the regular and habitual suspension of the law in the name of the law, can be known and understood through its relationship, yes, to the idea of racial hierarchy, yes, to the histories of imperial government, which required a real philosophical, literary, and humanistic resources be rendered in ambiguous and sometimes viciously racist forms. Any credible salvaging of Europe's great traditions must reckon with the problems raised by that complicity in the long history in which genocide, brutality, and torture were practiced not only as warfare but as political administration. For several hundred years, though, the standard bearers of conviviality, the people who have argued for a cosmopolitan view in which the stranger, the xenos, is placed under rules of hospitality, have been, well, they've often, I think, included people who are deeply and bitterly critical of the moral and political costs of Europe's criminal encounters with its colonial people. Indeed, I would suggest that there are ways of reading the canon of European Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment thinking precisely to demonstrate the force of what might be termed a counter-history in this area, a body of ethically infused reflections which is not amenable to any resolution in dialectical fantasies of sublation. That beleaguered tradition allows for the unfashionable possibility that the stranger, the alien, might be recognized as a human being, endowed with a dignity that is not qualified by racial hierarchy, and then, as I said, placed under the obligations of hospitality. Now, you know, even though we need to see all of that in its proper historical setting, I think we must try, against the odds, to revive that. We must also try, in the moment of aspiring to its revival, to move past it. To move past it into an understanding of our own predicament, which is illuminated by another Enlightenment theme, which may be relevant to the question of becoming Dutch. We have to find a new application and discover a new value for the practice of systematic estrangement from our own cultures. It's an old Enlightenment theme, that in order to know yourself, in order to know your own, I won't say national state, because it goes back before the formation of national states, but in order to understand your selfhood, your community, you had to become estranged from it. And that practice of estrangement is something that, that governs the emergence of particular kind of aesthetic strategies. We need to refine and return to that practice of systematic estrangement as a condition of self-understanding. Before Freud articulated that problem as cosmopolitan disillusion, that principled modern stance arose then at the intersection of artistic and anthropological concerns. It subverted the proper order of national states. It complicated the understanding of patriotism and solidarity, and of the proper relationship between human and citizen. Today, that way of seeing and of acting invites us into a better sense of culture, as a plural practice rather than a singular property, as a dynamic event rather than a moribund object, and perhaps a view of the museum not as a repository of civilization, but as a tool in the promotion of convivial interaction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that very challenging, I think, and important lecture. I think you have positioned us as a museum in a very interesting way as a space of culture. And I think it's quite interesting to think about a lot of those tensions that could be played out in the museum as a place who needs to think about that notion of equal cultural worth, but also civilizational sort of modes of being and how we might challenge those. But also, I hope, a space that we might think about, what would you say, re-evaluating that notion of erasure or forgetting or amnesia that you think is particularly European. So I think you've set a lot of challenges for us today. As everybody knows, I hope at this point we really like to open the floor to many questions. So I hope you might start thinking of some. I just wanted to ask you one thing, I suppose still hanging over from the discussion with Homi Bhabha last week, where we discussed this idea of global ambivalence. And I think you just referred to it earlier as possibly being part of that racial technology import from America. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit. Thank you.
I mean, I know that the inability to tolerate, how can I put it? The inability to live with ambivalence is a real issue that we can address, and that we can moralize the capacity to manage ambivalence. I know that the difference between fascism and psychoanalysis is that fascism says you don't need to be depressed, and psychoanalysis says I will teach you how to manage being depressed. Okay? What worries me about recognizing that ambivalence is that in some circumstances, I think ambivalence can be boiled down to an ability to do and live with anything. And that's my concern about it. I'm certainly not suggesting that Homi Bhabha makes that argument. Let me be absolutely 100% clear about that. But I do think there is a sense that investing in ambivalence can become a way of saying, well, you know, our national values are, let me think, freedom, liberty, etc. But the fact that we lock all these people up without trial and we never get to find out where they are or where they live or how they're treated, you know, is a problem. But it's ambivalence, really. So we'll just get on with what we're doing, you know. That we'll accept the impossible demands of an immoral and unjust world and write them off under the sign of ambivalence. That actually ambivalence becomes, or could become, a cipher for tolerating the intolerable, and allowing business as usual in a situation where business as usual cannot continue. You know, I don't know how I mean, one thing Homi Bhabha and I think myself really do share, actually, one thing we share, is a sense of the absolute urgency of this moment. And I think, you know, for me, I wouldn't want to characterize my own response to that urgency as one of ambivalence. I'm ambivalent about the Enlightenment tradition. I called for its revival and also its transcendence at the end, but I wouldn't again call that ambivalence. I would say that actually I have to take, even if it sounds vulgar, you know, I'm sorry about that, I feel I have to take certain sorts of positions now in a world of profane political choices. And that's not the same as saying that I'm yielding to the logic of if you're not with us, you're against us, with the fascistic political theology which is offered by our leaders. I don't want to repeat those gestures, but I do think that lines have to be drawn. Recently, you know, I was very honoured and privileged to work with Doris Salcedo on Shibboleth and to write a piece for that catalogue. I mean, it seems to me, I know she lost her temper at the press conference and started, because people kept saying, how did you do it, how did you do it? Which was an insult, actually, I think, to her. And therefore she was perhaps more explicit about its relationship to racial cleavage in the world as opposed to other forms of fracture. But I mean, that exercise seems to me an interesting case of the sort of thing I'm speaking about, because there an artist is drawing that line, even if it's one that, you know, toddlers trip over in and people use their high heels and so on. It's actually a way of saying that the security that we take for granted as a condition of our contemplative practice in beautiful institutions like this is something which is underpinned by a great violence, you know, and that's not a natural process, actually, at all.
Thank you. I'd love to open it immediately to the floor. Who has a question for us? Somebody up above? Erwin, here, thank you.
Yeah, I would like you to ask to develop a bit more on the comparison you made between the return of the nation state in politics and the separated disciplines in the academic.
Well, I think in both cases, this is was connected in my own mind by what I call a failure of political imagination. I mean, I don't think at any point used the words nation state. I try not to use the phrase nation state because the idea of nation state is something that is already, I think, holding out too much of an olive branch to the idea that this is a national political community. I said national state. And I say national state because I'm talking about the emergence of forms of state and statecraft and government which emerge from the principle of nationality. And I think that it's important to emphasize the imaginative work that goes into that. We can't imagine, you know, I mean, I'm not exactly clear, I don't want to ventriloquize Boris Groys, but I mean, he spoke yesterday about the idea that capitalism was the capitalism of nation states. I don't agree with that account of the history of capitalism. And that, you know, it's contentious, at the very least, to suggest that that's true. There are varieties, I mean, I don't need to recapitulate this, there are endless varieties of world systems, approaches to the history of capitalism that show that some of the novelty we imagine in investing in globalization has to be much more tightly and carefully specified. With regard to disciplines and the failure of imagination there, I think there are, again, there's a long version of this and a short version of this. The short version would be that in many places, and I think I would include the Netherlands in this, there were political struggles within the university by the generation of 1956, if I can broadly call it that, by the generation of 1968, if I can broadly call it that, and by the 70s people, to change and amend the character of university life. And that one of those features was not a disrespect for disciplines, but a sense that there, of course, and this actually goes back earlier to Lukács and to Adorno's sense of where the disciplines came from in the first place and how forms of class interest and cultural capital produced the disciplines as responses to a certain set of modern political challenges. That we were going to amend those disciplinary projects. We would see those disciplines as works in progress or ideas that were fluid, and that we would understand that the rather arbitrary ways in which the disciplinary traditions had developed in different places pointed to the possibility of richer multidisciplinary work, and that we weren't going to be inhibited, you know. We weren't going to be inhibited every time, you know. Unfortunately, I've never been trained in any discipline. I'm very proud of that. Although when I needed a job and I couldn't get a job, the people that offered me one was a sociologist. So I became a sociologist like that. I know my story is a little untypical. Anyway, the idea was really that we would amend these disciplinary boundaries. We would question how they had been constituted. We would interrogate the ways in which they had been reproduced, and that we would enrich our practice of, politically informed intellectual work by a sense of those problems. Now, when I worked in the States, in the US for 6 years, I saw students who would come to me, would be in my class, graduate students doing their PhDs in, a very elite environment with no anxieties about money. And they'd come to me and say, well, I'm trained as a philosopher, and but do you think, perhaps there's a historical point, but I'm not trained as a historian, so I can't. There's an incredible inhibition there. And I think that's one problem, because we're training people who think like that. As the PhD itself has diminished as a qualification, I get people now coming to me who know about their PhD, but who know about nothing else at all. They're half an inch wide, these people. They're about 3 inches deep, or 4 inches deep, but they're half an inch wide. And I think that's a problem. And I think that, now, and my third illustration would be that a lot of people who went around as the advocates, the loud advocates of cultural studies, who were the ones who wanted us to study shopping, You go and ask them now what they are disciplinarily, and they say, I'm a historian of Victorian life between 1876 and 1877. They've retreated from a project which may have been rhetorically overblown now to a tiny space, a space immediately under their feet. So I think in both cases we're looking at anchors. We're looking at the need to find security, in insecure environments. And, to talk honestly about the present state of universities. And, I find myself in alliance with all sorts of extremely conservative people who believe that, universities are places where people should be educated, where people should read books, and that we serve our educational strategy very badly if we make people take on vast amounts of debt in order to become educated in these ways. So I think it's the pursuit of security in both cases that tells us we can imagine nothing other than a world of national states. It's the pursuit of security which tells us we can imagine nothing other than an institutional educational system only configured by disciplines. I think that if I'm sounding a bit 9-10 in saying this, the area studies approaches which constituted or warranted a great deal of interdisciplinary work in the period up to the eruption of September 2001, have been somewhat reconstituted in that they need to have people who can speak Arabic and speak Farsi and so on. They are now, of course, putting anthropologists into the battlefield. I don't know if you've been following the controversy about the emergence of embedded anthropologists who, we can snigger about it. But the fact is, this is a major story and a major development in that certainly the US military is now paying out these surplus anthropologists who have no prospect of university education to go into the battlefield to guide the practice of the war, of the, they try at that point not to call it war, they call it counterinsurgency. So I think the role of the embedded anthropologist in the prosecution of counterinsurgency is also another symptom. But I think the fact that there are lots of surplus anthropologists and the fact that people imagine they can protect themselves from the political tides that roll into those institutional spaces by standing on an ever smaller and smaller piece of solid ground is symptomatic. So I think security connects both. I think that the argument about national tradition and national culture, which is very strong in our country, connects both. I think that the kinds of disputes we've seen about the history curriculum, in Japan, in France, I don't know if you have this here yet, about, where is the history of the Netherlands' world domination going to be in the history books? Simon Sharma doesn't seem interested in it. You can read An Embarrassment of Riches all the way through and you won't find any acknowledgement of any of that. So what version of the history of this country is going to circulate? How is its, I don't know, what's an obvious example? Its humanistic traditions going to be rendered in relation to the conditions of colonial emergence? Are we going to see that connection as something that might be articulated in ways that strengthen your tradition, but also open it to other people whose connections to it might be marginalized in the way it's currently configured.
Thank you. Rosie, if you just wait for the microphone. Yvette, just over here. Thanks.
Thank you very much for a wonderful, elegant, thought-provoking paper. Millions of questions, but I'll select one. The neologisms were fantastic. I think the paper is worth reading just from that point of view. I hadn't heard xenology before. I'm immediately going to appropriate it, I'm warning you. Now my question is, how would you position the figuration or the figure, the character of the homegrown terrorist in what is your lifelong critique and analysis of xenology? Is it is it a condensation, is it an implosion, is it a hybrid, continuity, discontinuities? Thank you.
Well, I draw the term xenology not from my own head, but from the work of Chetan Bhatt, my colleague, Chetan Bhatt, who I admire very much, and who's been working for the last 3 or 4 years on political Islam and as a transnational space. Yes, the figure of the homegrown terrorist as a cipher in this. I mean, of course, there's a sort of implicit sense that all immigrants are implicitly terroristic. And it goes, if you go back into the beginning of the 20th century and to the Jewish mass migration into England in the early years of the 20th century, particularly the arguments of the relationship, the idea that these Jews were coming into Britain and bringing anarchism with them, and bringing disorder. And there's the sort of scenario which is dramatized by Conrad in The Secret Agent, you know, where they go to blow up the Meridian. I mean, there are a sense in which we can, I think, profit from seeing a much longer term connection between the figure of the terrorist and the immigrant. I mean, actually it goes back before Conrad in the British case to the Phoenix Park murders and the figure of Athenians, really, and whether or not that figure is actually a stranger or not, I don't think the figure is. I don't think that's a xenology. I think it's a sort of becoming xenology in the sense that we're trying to estrange something that shouldn't really be estranged. In every case, in the figure of the Irishman with a bomb and a mask, under his cloak or a dagger, perhaps, in Phoenix Park, to the figures on the video screen. These are familiar figures, actually, but we speak about them as if we have no sense of the historical forces, the cultural tides, the economic exploitation, the tragedy, brutality, and violence that generates their disenchantment. I mean, that's why I took the provocative step of suggesting that it might be more helpful to see these political choices in the context of a just war argument. And I know that's a deeply contentious thing. So I think the homegrown terrorist certainly raises this question. And what is left out of that figure, of course, is the issue of the convert, which I also tried to just briefly touch on. Now, I do try and remember everything, but I can't remember the name of the Belgian young woman who was a fundamentalist terrorist. It's in my. I would be happy to send it to Annie when I get back to my computer to remind. But what I'm trying to say is that we don't. It's not as if we're being drowning in information which says, well, look at this white European person who went over and become a terrorist. Or, I mean, there's a certain amount of coverage at home when we look at the wives that these men have acquired who turn out to be English converts to Islam. There's a certain sense in which they usually sell their stories to the newspapers and try and, or the newspapers find them and they have to cooperate with the sort of family romance of homegrown terrorism in the sense that they become visible elements or emblems of the deviancy, of the peculiarity and perversity of the homegrown terrorist when it comes to crossing these cultural lines which are unbridgeable without catastrophic consequences. So I think I'm for much tighter focus really on the question of the convert. I'm much more interested in how not all of our biographies of the homegrown terrorists actually, even I mean, I'll give another practical example. You know, some people will be familiar with this. The work I did on the shoe bomber, Richard Reed, he was written about, so he was an immigrant. But of course, he hadn't immigrated. His grandfather had been a migrant, and his father had been a Hell's Angel. And his father, when asked about this, said, well, I think what he got from his involvement in political Islam was rather like what I got from being a Hell's Angel. And I think we'd have a healthier understanding of the risks involved in all of this and the sociogenesis of these problems, you know, if we were able to see the life of someone like Richard Reed a little bit more in relation to the experiences his father had as a Hell's Angel and a little bit less in the context of a clash of civilizations.
Absolutely. Renee? Oh, somebody has it already up there? Okay. Of course.
Okay, thanks very much for your paper, Paul. It was it had many really interesting points. There's a couple of things I was just very interested in some more elaboration on. Right at the end, you touched briefly on the question of the value of systematic estrangement, and the way it emerges from a certain intersection between aesthetics and anthropology, and the way that we could start to construct a counter-history of those moments of systematic estrangement. And you mentioned Freud. But I wondered if you could evoke any other figures who, for you, stand as a kind of emblem of this tradition. That's my first question.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think there are ways. I said it was a problem of the canon. I think that you know, Freud was an assiduous reader of Montaigne. I'm sure there are people here who can know more about that than I do. So I would actually want to be, if I was going to write that book, I'd start with Montaigne. And I would start with Montaigne and the fact that Montaigne meets the cannibal in Rouen, that Montaigne meets the cannibal at the end of his road, as it were, and that Montaigne's selfhood, Montaigne's practice of selfhood involves a number of things that we, you know, probably wrongly and erroneously, the Montaigne scholars who are half an inch wide but several meters deep will tell us, we shouldn't do, which is that we read Montaigne as our contemporary. You know, we read him as our contemporary for a number of reasons. And we read his, what's the word? His practice of ipseity, his systematic practice of a relationship with himself through his writing of essays, through his argument about embodiment, through his understanding of the value of the body, as things that we instantly recognize as being contemporary. So I guess I would start with Montaigne. And I think that there are lots of ways of reading the stories, the literature, the archive of European expansion and conquest that find, I won't say successors, but analogues of those problems, both in Europe and beyond it. Of course, you know, within the general proviso that the other is always much more cosmopolitan figure than people expect the other to be.
Thank you. The second question was your formulation of the idea of a securitocracy. What I thought was the kind of, there was many aspects of that were very interesting, but there was one aspect that I was really interested in, which was that you talked about preemption in relation to when you were growing up, but I thought maybe you related it to the question of stop and search laws in the 80s, and then you talked about preemption even further back in terms of the aftermath of the Napoleonic conquest, and that's really interesting because we gave a workshop on preemption and power, and we were working with a very contemporary notion, of course, the notion of preemptive military strikes announced by the US national security after 2002. But what you were suggesting was a much longer trajectory. You were effectively suggesting that there are different moments of preemption, that we have to not just look in terms of 2002, but actually broaden that and see preemption as a kind of recurrent practice that recurs in moments that are understood as crisis. And I thought that was fascinating because maybe we've been working with an overly narrow notion of what preemption means and the way in which it determines a kind of predatory relation of the future, in which you invoke a future precisely to control it in advance of its occurrence. And you were saying that goes back a long way, and we have to rethink that tradition, not just in terms of a post 9/11, actually much further.
Yeah. Well, again, I would go back to, you know, the reading of the requirement from the prows of Spanish ships anchored off the coast of the New World. I don't know how many leagues offshore they would, is it 7, Rosie? I don't know. They would anchor the ship, and then they would stand in the prow in the night and bellow the legal order of the requirement into the darkness, knowing that if anybody was listening, they wouldn't be able to understand Spanish anyway. So the question is, you know, is that preemption? I don't know. Is that I suppose you could argue within what you're saying that preemptive aspiration, or that horizon, the time horizon, the moral horizon involved, is something which is integral to the practice of colonial conflict. And I think I do believe that to be the case. That would be my, symbolic originary source for that question. I mean, here, you know, we are in Holland, let's deal with that for a moment. I think that any archive of colonial war, anyone from Indonesia, anyone from anywhere, you can spend 5 minutes reading the archive of colonial war, whether you look at the biographies of the great generals, or the letters of the colonial officials, or the horrific outrage sentiments of the missionaries. Whichever archive you go to, you will see that wherever there was that conflict, there was always preemptive strike by the Europeans. That's always been the case. It's intrinsic, actually, to the practice of colonial administration. And that's why, and I've written about this before, you know, when you look at the Geneva Conventions or whatever, you see that they only apply to certain kinds of conflict. They are not universal declarations of the rules that would govern the conduct of war. They are not, you know, civilizing to that degree. They don't aspire to that kind of coverage. They refer only to a very narrow area of conflict and belligerence. So, yes, I would say that those things are intrinsic to the prosecution of particular kinds of war, and that you recognize that, and that if you don't recognize that, you don't understand the injuries and the historical wounds that the people that you are now committed to fighting indefinitely into the future bring back to bear upon you, because you don't know your own history. I mean, actually, it's not funny. I don't know how, you know, again, I feel terribly ignorant about this, but here, I mean, let's find some, native informants. I mean, where's the history of Dutch colonial crimes in Indonesia taught in your educational system? Where do you go to learn that? How do you learn it, if you have, you know? I mean, I get English kids, you know, if I'm interested in outreach and things like this. So I meet you know, I even teach undergraduates, and many of them don't know that Afghanistan and Palestine and what Churchill's folly, Iraq, you know, were part of the British Empire, and all these conflicts are actually part of the breakup of that system. They don't know that. They actually don't know that. Now, you know, that to me is an incredible indictment. I know we've got millions and millions of people in our country who can't even add 2-3-digit numbers together. So actually, there are forms of engaging the arguments about illiteracy in ways that actually promote questions of not just historical literacy and cultural literacy, but a kind of moral literacy to match. So actually, for me, the question of education and the, if you like, the pedagogic moment of the project of Becoming Dutch become much more significant in the light of this struggle with ignorance. Academics are very bad at thinking about ignorance. You know, we think Machiavelli wrote the book on the politics of ignorance. You know, I think Robert Proctor and Londa Schibbinger, two people I've both had a lot of conflict with, are very acute in saying that actually we need to have ways of thinking about of ignorance, which turn on the idea that ignorance isn't a vacuum into which truths get sucked. We need to have a vocabulary that identifies these problems of ignorance. I mean, they suggest that we use this other neologism, agnotology, although I think they found it somewhere else, that we actually identify the study of ignorance and its relationship to its institutions of cultural reproduction. Agnotology, the production of ignorance culturally. Let's become agnotologists. Let's understand how ignorance emerges, how it's reproduced, what its institutional supports are, what's an economy of ignorance in this situation. Let's embrace that mission as part of what it means to invent a European culture which is you know, at ease with itself, which doesn't encounter the stranger and the alien only as sources of anxiety and fear.
Thank you. I have lots of questions now. Renee first, and then Nessa, and then we'll take the one back there. Okay.
Thank you. My question actually deals with the terminology of affirmative action or positive discrimination, now treated as, I think last year the Supreme Court made a decision about saying all types of, it's a type of discrimination, so therefore it's, and it's used in neoliberal talk as always a form of, in the negative, usually more than the positive. Is it so? How do we deal with fair chance? How do qualified people then come into positions of power? I wanted to hear if you had any thoughts on this.
Well, I don't agree with you that neoliberalism actually always looks at affirmative action in the negative. Sarkozy is not looking at affirmative action in the negative. Yeah. And there are lots of people in the corporate world who don't look at affirmative action in the negative either, because they have their cosmopolitan imagination too. The cosmopolitan imagination, not of the people in the numbered seats on Ryanair, but of the people who turn left when they get up the airplane steps. So I don't agree with you about that. I think that I don't think the capital has a clear view of that question, even in the United States, in the same way that it is divided over the place of the denizen in the some people want to give denizens driving licenses and some measure of civic recognition, others don't. And then that involves a political and an economic split. So I don't agree that we can line up neoliberalism with affirmative action. I used affirmative action and I hinted at a critical view of it only because, well, one thing, I don't like the idea that becomes an off-the-shelf technique for managing multiculturalism, which is shunted out into, I don't know, Brazil or South Africa or France, That's one reason. And the other reason is because my own experience of teaching in the US was that the institution where I worked was very good at meeting those quotas. But if you talk to the people who are actually the beneficiaries of those quotas, they all turned out not to be the people that we thought they ought to be, that they were people, who were African American to the extent that one of their parents had come from Africa, or two, in the previous generation of migrancy. They weren't. So in a way, I don't think those technologies work very well. Yeah. And I'm not scared of saying that. Mm-hmm. And I'm not scared of saying that there are better ways of doing that job. And that sometimes, and this may be contentious, I don't know, that looking at people's poverty might be a better way of actually helping the people who need to be helped than getting into some sort of culture talk about that. I mean, of course, in the US, you raised that, so let me just say one more thing about it. The issue of reparation, which is fundamental to this question, is one which is not thought to be worth discussing unless it's in the context of, I don't know, thinking about the genocide in Europe, for which the United States was not responsible. The genocide of the Third Reich. So to put the history of slavery into cold storage and to say it's historically inaccessible to the idea of reparative justice is, of course, for me, completely wrong, and involves, a set of arbitrary judgments about the relationship of the past to the future and the present.
Thank you. Nessa?
I would like to come back to the question of the homegrown terrorists, and because the question of, terrorism in general is, let's say, dominantly masculine. So the question of, my question is very pragmatic. It's in relation to the alternatives you have suggested, and how would those alternatives, like conviviality and so on, be seen from an original gender perspective, other than the veil and that kind of thing, which is just the opposite of what you said. So how would you look at it? Is there a way to do it actually as a woman? Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Well, I think there are a number of ways of looking at conviviality that speak to this issue that you've raised, and which are, how can I put it? Well, I think involve a real attention to the question of the scale upon which we want to make the analysis of what conviviality adds to our lives and where it's practiced. I think Daniel Miller, the anthropologist, has been writing about very small societies and doing work. And certainly in the work that I've been planning to do next in London, I'm very interested in I suppose it's a kind of ground that some of the people who write about social capital are also concerned with, in the sense that you look at everyday life and you look at where people negotiate linguistic and religious and cultural boundaries in the reproduction of their own lives and their own communities and their own households. And there are a number of ways of opening that up that make it clear that that we're not talking about an experience of work alone, or we're not talking about the relationship between labour market competition and other forms of identity alone. We might, for example, want to look at the economics involved in street markets. I was walking back through the street market yesterday afternoon as the darkness was going on. I was just thinking about how people here negotiate those questions in their everyday life and in the currency of their shopping experiences, not through the swirl of consumerism, but just in a much more basic sort of everyday way. One project that we're hoping to get looks at the role of convivial interaction in and around healthcare. We don't normally talk, for example, about hospitals as places where convivial interaction unfolds. And yet, if you come to our hospitals, you'll see that not only that the people who are being served as patients, but also the people who are doing the work in the hospitals are an incredible range of cosmopolitan folks, many speaking their third and fourth language in their interactions with their fellows. I think, there are questions to be argued about childcare and about the work-life balance and about who cares for whose children and under what circumstances and who pays for that work and how that labour negotiates differences and how the government mediates those things by promoting the forms of recognition. So I guess I'd want to say that that I don't see conviviality as the business of men any more than the business of children or the business of women, and that any institution that we've drawn in terms of everyday life, whether it's a school, whether it's a workplace, whether it's an unemployment benefit office, whether it's a prison, in each of these places we will be able to identify forms and patterns of interaction that we could call convivial, and which the people who undergo or experience them would name in those terms, even if they don't use that word. And I think the issue is more, for me, one of how we give some theoretical or social value to those things. How we see in them, a different view of how cross-cultural, trans-cultural interaction takes place, which is not obstructive. Now, you raised the question of the veiled woman as a sort of antithesis of this, but I think veiled women have convivial interaction. Might be thought of as being participants in convivial interaction as well. I don't see that the issue of covering your head is necessarily an obstruction to that possibility of conviviality. And I think we need to be able to show that that isn't the case. Because there are many people who would argue that withholding your face, if you wear a niqab, say, that becomes an insurmountable barrier, to the point that, as we know, our political masters and mistresses fantasize about criminalizing that gesture for those reasons. So I don't see that, and one of the reasons I'm attached to the idea of conviviality is, I suppose, I don't think it lines up tidily with a kind of public-private dichotomy in which, public life and civic life are essentially gendered one way and private and household life are gendered the other way. It seems to me that conviviality works both sides of those lines and promotes. That's why I suggested that there was, I think the things I said were there was care, there was conflict, there was desire. I can't remember what the fourth thing was. There were several of them. And anyway, in each case, I tried to pick things that crossed the line of public and private, and that things that were not amenable to being simply gendered one way or the other. Of course, the figure of the homegrown terrorist who is female, and there are such figures, is, although we haven't yet had a suicide bomber who is female yet in England, and I'm sure when we do that, we'll raise interesting questions about the ways in which identity is held and the gendering of those cultural differences. That goes back really to a much older argument about immigration, in which, quote-unquote Asians, or we don't hear that quite so much these days, were always people who were deviant to the extent that they were inappropriately attached to the form of culture that ruled their lives, that they were too intensively attached to their culture. And this is tied, of course, to an argument about the family forms and patterns of household organisation, which, you know, were at one point people were beginning to say, well, we need to be more like them because they have families and they all sit down and have meals together and they're not sort of, you know, running past each other, you know, in the swirl of everyday life. There's something we can learn from that. Well, that idea, I think, has retreated again, and we're back to where we were in the 70s, to the extent that people are thought to have too much culture. When we used to write about this in the 70s, we used to call it the Goldilocks and the Three Bears theory of culture, because there were some people who had too little culture, mostly Africans and Caribbean people, or Caribbean people particularly. Africans have more. And then there were people who had too much culture, who were all Asian, and that was their religion, and family life was a proof of that. And then there were the people just in the middle who knew when to stop. The golden mean of culture, as the golden mean of porridge, was that it was at the right temperature all the time. And I think that we've really, you know, I've really tried to, in pushing an argument about giving a sense of importance to convivial interactions, to shift that line away from what men do only. You know, and to see that there are different patterns, institutional habitus of conviviality that we can identify, that women practice, that men practice, but also, as I say, that children practice. Because I think to put the child into that story is part of what it means to open it up in a way that's really meaningful.
Thank you. There was a question here, yep. Yvette, just there, third, fourth row. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you about this idea of sameness as a fantasy. Yes, we all know that. Mm-hmm. Basically, I don't have to really ask anything about that. Of course, people like to recognize things so they feel safe and da-da-dee-da-da-da. Could you maybe tell me something about the whole fear factor issue, which, of course, now is very important as it is growing. I don't really see it, you know, breaking down or softening, and yeah, I'm just throwing this now onto the floor. Maybe you can just say something to it.
You mean that people? Well, when I talk about securitocracy, I'm talking about two things. I'm talking, on the one hand, about how security comes to dominate the other functions of government, right? And then I'm talking about governing through security, not governing through freedom, governing through security. So obviously, the issue of fear and the orchestration of fear fits with that. And I also use the phrase info-war because I'm trying to suggest to you that in this moment, and this goes back to the things that Boris Groys actually was talking about yesterday, the flow of information is not something that stands outside the conflict or comes to it later, comes subsequently. This politics of ignorance, this agnotology, if you like, suggests that those images and the flow of information are part of that conflict. So when, you know, Steve McQueen makes his stamp structure in which we see the faces of the dead and reminds us in acknowledging that loss that we don't, that we mustn't actually forget that there are millions and millions of other people in the past who've also been the victims of British imperial and neo-colonial violence in various kinds of conflict. When he does that, and when he challenges the government to make a civic compact in which we allow these things to become part of our public life, when we do that, we are engaging the politics of fear, and we're pushing on a boundary. The government replies to that by beginning to show images of the soldiers and the wounded, the corpses and the coffins, and the wounded coming back from the battlefield, what they call theatre. They never call it the battlefield, they call it theatre, right? Coming back from theatre, we see now a range of different images which acknowledge this loss and which tell us that the government, the nation, cares about it. And that culminates in what's been happening at the football. I said they bring the veterans, so-called, they use the American word now. They don't call them ex-soldiers, that's what they used to call them. Now they call them veterans. People who are shown to the crowd, who show their injuries, who show their presence as a way of affirming and creating a certain kind of solidarity. Now, I believe that an emphasis on conviviality, a practical attention to the way we live our cultural and our economic and social lives within our post-colonial cities will reveal that there are no problems, but that the problems are a different order, and that the conflicts will arise even in semi-segregated urban spaces, but a lot of the time there will be people who interact with each other across that line of culture without a sense of fear, without an inhibition, and to the mutual profit and benefit of them, and that we can see that clearly if we don't admit a view of those people as already captured or pickled within particular ethnic, absolute cultural spaces to which they are permanently attached. Okay? And then we need a better account of that than one which says there's generation one, that's the migrants, there's generation two, the children of migrants who might be half immigrants, but if we don't let, and then there's another story, in generation three, which is where the tensions come because people have to choose one way or the other. I was in generation two, then they used to tell us that we were the ones who had an identity crisis because we were between two cultures and all this kind of rubbish. And there's a history to those ideas. There's a history to those ideas, which is largely, as I try to emphasize, a history of US racial technologies, right? In which particular conceptions of identity, particular conceptions of culture are folded over into the story of what we might call involution, the transformation of immigrants and settlers, their strangeness, into sameness. That involutionary process which takes difference and makes it the same. Now, I think we've got lots of resources that give us a chance to tell a better story about our lives than that. But it involves a change of scale, it involves a different sense of culture, it involves a different sense of plurality, and it involves one more thing, which is that we shouldn't, in telling that story about conviviality, in telling that story about everyday, habitable multiculture, look as though we're saying, there's no problem really. There are problems. There's certainly racism there in those encounters, but the point is, people, most of the time, not all the time, most of the time, people deal with it. People deal with it. Racist insults, come and they go. Patterns of local authority. I don't know how you manage your housing stock here. I know that there was a point where you were bringing people, black people, from England who had worked in local government, who knew about the stories that had come out of local government statecraft to help with the management of the housing stock and things like that. But I mean, much of this is really down not to the culture of people, but to the governance of people at local level. How are they going to dwell? How is the housing market going to function? If we've got a hyperinflationary housing market, how are we going to think about the anxieties and the fears of people? I didn't really talk about melancholia today and on what it means for people to develop systematically a melancholic relationship to their colonial past, a melancholic relationship to their imperial prestige, which is gone. A sense that they remain marked by it, they can't give it up, they neurotically want to hang on to it. I'm sure you've got some versions of that here, I know that you do have. So the question is how that melancholic account of the relationship with the past, with the Dutch as the victims of their history, rather than the immigrants and the settlers and the allochtones as the victims of the Dutch, how does that economy work? That's the question. And I think your issue about fear, which you call the fear factor, at first I thought you were referring to that TV program where people eat insects and things like that. I'm sorry, I was off on a different frequency. When we need to know how those two different stories really fit together and how they can be made to, and to say, well, there are noble traditions in which, particularly, I know we're not in Amsterdam here, we're in Brabant, right? So I don't actually know, I'm ashamed to say, how the world got here. Okay, but the world is here. The world is here. No question about it. The world is here. Amsterdam, I think I know that story, but here I don't exactly know that story. But the world is here. And 5 minutes outside this building, well, no, not 5. Well, how much ever time you want to spend, you will find the world here. So the question is, how did the world get here? What's the world doing here? How's the world changing? What's being here? And how do people deal with that? And is there a way of imagining? I was walking through the streets yesterday and I saw several pictures of the PSV football team, who are kind of local deities at the moment, right? But I was very struck by the way the paintings of the PSV team actually echoed the stereotypical facial attributes of Black Peter, who I also met walking through the streets of Eindhoven. Now, I'm not a PC person to the extent that I think we solved the problem that Black Peter represents by saying you can't have Black Peter, right? Because Black Peter's offensive. But it was clear also from conversations that we've had over the last couple of days that 30 years ago in this country, there was a debate about these things, right? There was an intense debate about a serious consideration of whether that was necessary for the future of a habitable, liberal country, right? So I would like to submit, you know, even though I know you want your chocolates and your Christmas presents, if you celebrate, and if you don't, because there were some veiled women with their children introducing them to Black Peter in the shopping centre actually yesterday afternoon, that there are all sorts of convivial opportunities involved in actually working through the problem of Black Peter, even now. So, and I would like to imagine that there are people who are committed to that and don't feel that they are, you know, they can either abstract that from all the other problems or feel that in doing that work, that they've solved the problem of multiculture in this country. They haven't. It's just one more thing. And having that conversation, making it serious, making it part of your political culture, right, is something that enriches that and enriches you.
Thank you.
Isn't nostalgia also a very nice safe ground?
Nostalgia.
In a way.
Well, who's nostalgic?
To escape?
Well, maybe it would be, but how can we be nostalgic about something when we don't even know what it is? I mean, if we don't know how many people were killed in Indonesia, how can we be nostalgic about it? If we don't know what the Dutch special forces are doing in Afghanistan, how can we be nostalgic about the fact they used to do other better things, helping children across the street and all the other stuff you guys have been doing in the 20th century? I don't know. First of all, we need to ventilate this history. You know, we need to ventilate it. We need to bring it to light. We need to have a look at it. We have to think about it. You know, if we don't want to be trapped in that melancholic reflex, you know, oh, poor me, I've lost my empire, poor me, you know, my soldiers are being asked to do horrible things. Oh, my soldiers did horrible things. What am I going to do about the fact that we did horrible things, you know? Flay myself. Oh, and you immigrants, you better be grateful for the chance to be here amongst us because we know we did horrible things, right? If we're going to get into that, I think the nostalgia would come later, actually. I don't know. But again, I have to submit to the native informants.
I'm more related to nostalgia and little cultural exercises that people do in order to hang on to something, you know. But thank you anyway for your discourse.
I could take maybe one more question before we stop. Wendelin.
Thank you. I just wanted to come back to something that I think is quite interesting to bring up here about the specific colonial past that Holland has. And you mentioned that in this very moment there is some depoliticizing mechanisms going on, and that is partly, if I understood right, partly expressed in the corporate language of controlling the world and its runnings. And I found my thoughts went to how Holland has always had a very specific relationship between corporate and state in its colonial history. So I thought maybe there is something to think about, or I don't know, elaborate further on.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely right. And one of the things that angered me very much at home during the earlier parts of this year when we were commemorating the end of the legislation on the slave trade was that we, you know, people in the communities descended from the slaves were saying, oh, we want the Queen to apologize, we want Tony Blair to apologize. And, you know, I'm not against that. I'm happy to listen to those apologies. I would like there to be more apologies, generally speaking. But I actually felt that in making the demand for apology, even in that ritual form, a political demand, we were missing the point. And the point was actually that Lloyds and Barclays and the insurance traders and the people that invented new forms of bond, new forms of speculation, the people that made the financial institutions of our country, which drew their capital from that trade, nobody asked them to apologize at all, you know, because that, in a sense, that process is naturalized, absolutely. And there was very little pressure placed upon them. So this, you know, I don't know enough about the history of the Netherlands East India Company, for example, to know how its forms of capital conditioned the emergence of other institutions within this country. But I'm sure that there's a very good story there. And I'm sure that there are notions of corporate responsibility that would enable you to find some levers on that past. Sven Lindqvist, who I know, wrote a book in Sweden, I think it sold very well, training workers or helping them to know how to track through the archive the history of the companies that they worked for, as a kind of, workerist pedagogic thing. And I think there's a lot to do in that space actually now, to put those people under pressure. And again, I am ashamed to say I didn't have a chance to, before I came here, find out more about the history of Philips and its relationship to this particular town, and about the provenance of Philips in weapons manufacture and so on. Now they must be involved in these things. I didn't, as I say, have a chance to research before I came, but I hope that there would be people in this conversation, given that it's just adjacent to where we're sitting, who would actually have some of that information at their fingertips and might want to fold it back into the issue of what is involved in becoming Dutch, yes, but also becoming Dutch here.
In fact, Wendelin, who posed the question, is developing a project around looking at Philips, so maybe we'll invite you back. We'll invite you back to see it.
Listen to that. Yes,
any other urgent questions, or shall I close for lunch? Okay, I would like to take this moment to really profoundly thank Paul Gilroy for a wonderful morning. Thank you very much.